Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. The United States has a new president, but just what does the Biden administration mean for Europe? After a tricky 4 years under Trump, are all sides ready to reset transatlantic relations? The last 4 years under the Trump administration have seen relations between the US and Europe on rather tricky ground, with disagreements on everything from climate change to the role of NATO, not to mention a multi-billion-dollar trade dispute over tariffs, especially over aircraft parts. Leaders across Europe will be hoping President Biden can create new opportunities for everyone to work together. Because in spite of the transatlantic difficulties of the last few years, America remains the EU's largest global trading partner. Trade between the US and EU in 2020 was worth around $600 billion. If you add in a post-Brexit United Kingdom, that adds another $100 billion. But if the European Union, fresh from brand new agreements with both China and of course a departing UK in the final weeks of December 2020, are hoping for a new deal with the US soon, they may be disappointed. President Biden has ruled out prioritizing any trade deals in his first 100 days. In what the British press in particular took as a major snub to Boris Johnson, of course looking for a new global trade order for the UK post-Brexit, Biden told the New York Times that he wasn't going to enter any new agreements until we've made, quote, major investments here at home and in our workers and in education. European leaders will, though, be keen to work with the new US administration straight away on the so-called soft power end of the policy spectrum. The new president, unlike his predecessor, has made it clear he sees NATO at the very heart of transatlantic security, and of course has promised to rejoin the Paris Climate Change Agreement. But it is the very early days of a new administration, so we'll have to wait to see how things really progress from here. So let's talk trade. Joining me now are Ali Renison, head of EU and trade policy at the Institute of Directors in the UK, and the former chief economist at the Italian Treasury, Lorenzo Codogno. Welcome both. Lorenzo, let's start with you. What do you think we can expect to see in terms of relations between the EU and the US?
Well, you know, I think with a shift in the administration in the States, clearly in terms of form, it will change a lot. In terms of substance, remains to be seen. In other words, I think the underlying problems in terms of global trade are still there. And certainly they don't change with the change of the US administration, but certainly the confrontational stance introduced by Trump will disappear. And I think there will be a much more constructive attitude by the US administration. But the underlying substance remains the same. So the underlying strategic issues and problems remain unchanged. So I think there will be a need for many years of negotiations in order to sort out existing problems.
And Ali Renison, what we don't have is years. Let's talk about a US-UK trade deal. It's a critical time for that. What are the hopes for a swift deal to be done?
Well, I think actually in terms of speed, that stopped being a priority for both sides, particularly even the UK. I think the UK will be glad of a respite of sorts, and that's because the US trade deal is politically contentious in the UK, particularly amongst the farmers and the farming lobby. So I think while negotiations will probably continue, although we know that President-elect Biden is not making lots of trade deals his huge priority. I think the fact that negotiations have certainly started, those will continue, but perhaps at a slower pace. And I think you'll start to see other areas emerge for cooperation priorities between the UK and the US, particularly around climate change. The UK is not only hosting the G7, but also the Climate Change Summit, the UN Climate Change Summit later this year. So I think those are kind of the areas you'll see more progress on than necessarily trade immediately.
Lorenzo, the EU and, as you've indicated, the Trump administration at loggerheads over a number of issues, not least aircraft subsidies. Will Biden, do you think, end that kind of attitude, end that trade war?
again, in terms of attitude, there will be a huge change. In terms of substance, I would say difficulties are still there. We know that TTIP ended up very badly, and I don't see that situation to change radically in the near term. It will take years. I mean, the underlying problems are still there, and I think negotiation will not be easy, even with a new administration in the US.
And Lorenzo, again, The Economist, just one magazine, has been calling this a transatlantic rift. Would you call it a rift? And if so, how quickly can that be healed?
Well, with the previous administration, certainly was a rift. With the new administration, I think there is an opportunity to re-establish strong ties, also from a trade perspective. But again, it will take time.
And Ali, what will a Biden presidency mean for Brexit and trade and the UK?
Well, I think certainly it's not a Trump administration which was enthusiastically pursuing a US-UK deal. Having said that, I think there are a number of common interests in areas where the UK wants to show that it can flex its post-Brexit muscle, particularly on cooperating on different areas, whether it's relating to the relationship with trade on China, whether it's relating to, for example, looking at some of the defense issues. You know, the UK really wants to reestablish itself. And I think when we hear from the British government talking about that its trade policy after Brexit is going to be a values-based trade policy, that's what it's hoping to appeal to with the US to some extent. But the UK really wants to, I think, show that it can do things differently from the EU. And while there is some justification for that, I think you have business wanting to try and make sure that we actually prioritize what helps trade for the UK, not just what the UK government can do on trade to sort of present itself after Brexit.
Are there any, Ali, natural opportunities at the moment for the UK outside the EU with the US?
Well, I think it's always going to be a sort of difficult relationship on trade simply because a lot of British industry is a bit nervous about what opening up to trade with the US would look like. Now, having said that, I think in a number of areas, whether it's cooperation on multilateralism and other areas, particularly I think in the digital space, you know, the UK and the US, they care a lot about, for example, intellectual property enforcement. So I think those are kind of areas to not only liberalize on, but actually work together on externally throughout the world. So I think digital will definitely be one of the areas where you see opportunities, but particularly in agriculture, that's going to still continue to be a contentious subject.
And Lorenzo, that is a contentious subject, isn't it? Because Brussels is determined to hold Silicon Valley to account.
Well, absolutely. I think digital remains a very critical area, not only for the EU, but I would say for the whole world in terms of trade. I think this is going to be addressed probably in the future, also in terms of relationship between the UK and the EU, because there are many areas, particularly in terms of data security and stuff like that, that have remained open in the deal that was signed at the end of last year.
And Lorenzo, some German politicians are hoping to revive the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which was basically a rather ill-fated Obama-era initiative. Public attitudes on big trade deals seems to have soured a lot on both sides of the Atlantic. Do you expect any change under President Biden to that?
I think the change in terms of attitude will be substantial, but the underlying problems that the TTIP process faced in the past are still there. And I think some critical aspects, such as agricultural policies, will still be very controversial. I think there is one item that will be very high on the agenda of European authorities in the near term, which is taxation on internet trade. And that is going to be very controversial, especially with the US.
Ali, President Biden has been talking about his relationship, a patched-up relationship with the British Prime Minister, will decide the destiny of the world. That's not me saying it. That's not Boris saying it. That's President Biden saying it. What do you expect from this new triangular relationship between Brussels, Boris and Biden?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask. You know, in the UK government, there seems to be a lot more focus on competition with the EU rather than cooperation. And I think that hopefully under the aegis of Biden, you know, there's more of an emphasis on sort of triangulating and trying to find what some of those common interests are, particularly on the multilateral front. You know, you've just seen, for example, the US wasn't particularly happy about the EU going and concluding a long-standing negotiation on investment with China. But at the end of the day, the EU is now pursuing this sort of quote unquote strategic autonomy on trade where it doesn't want to be relying on the US. So actually, it could emerge that the UK actually ends up being closer to the US administration in trying to do things in coordinated lockstep. And the EU does its sort of thing rather differently. But, you know, and I think that's what the challenge or the question is going to be, is how much of this is going to be cooperation rather than just competition.
And Lorenzo, again to you, there are financial problems within the European Union. Post-Brexit, how much will there be a circling of the wagons in Europe? How much will they say we've got to emphasize unity now rather more than trying to reach out across the pond?
There is a massive investment program that has been launched with European money. And I think in the near term, making sure that this is effective and successful is absolutely essential. So I think trade for now is not really top of the European agenda, although I think that Europe will continue to work with all international partners, US, but also China and the UK, to achieve a higher level of global integration.
Ali Renison, how much do you read into President Biden's first visit outside America will be to London to visit Boris Johnson? Is that significant? Is that a renewal of the special relationship?
I think it's important to be seen in itself and also in the context of why this is the first big sort of visit outside of certainly North America, because as you sort of imply, Biden is going to see Canada first. But in terms of the overseas visits, you know, ultimately this comes down to the UK is also hosting the G7 Presidency Summit. And so I think that's also sort of, you know, why it has to be seen in some context. Having said that, you know, and I do think we can't forget that Biden did intervene when the sort of Brexit negotiations were going on around Ireland and Northern Ireland. That's very important to him. But it's, you know, it's important to remember also that in the past, the UK, President Joe Biden has really come out to bat for the UK in certain areas. Historically, we're going back to things like the Falklands War. He very much supported the UK in that side proactively. And I think that, you know, Biden's role as a sort of consensus maker, you know, Brexit has now happened. And I think he has an interest in trying to bring together shared interests, shared values, and the UK fits that in a number of areas. The question is that as the relationship between the EU and the UK continues to develop in this new post-Brexit world, to what extent that's going to be a cause for concern outside of these waters. So, you know, a lot of this really depends on how the relationship between Brussels and London occurs. But I think, you know, Biden really wants to be the person who brings people together. And so I think we have to be seen in that context.
That's very optimistic, Lorenzo, isn't it? Biden wanting to bring people together. Are transatlantic relations going to be better under President Biden than under President Trump?
I think absolutely, because one of the first moves that President Biden will do is on climate change, which has been really a major divide between the two sides of the ocean. And I think that is really a very important move for Europeans. So there are areas where there will be a significant change. Other areas remain controversial, and the strategic interests of the US relative to Europe don't change much. But it's good that the new administration places a lot more emphasis on multilateral organizations, because I think what was missing with the Trump administration was the support to these organizations, which are the only one that can actually achieve results on an international stage on major issues on trade, but also everything else.
Ali Renison, same question to you.
Well, I think, I mean, looking at it, and Lorenzo is right to highlight sort of the climate aspect for that. You know, that is where the UK is probably hoping to, under Boris Johnson, put Brexit behind it as much as it can be able to. We know that, as Lorenzo mentioned, that relationship continues to evolve on trade in particular. But the UK, I think, is very desperate to be seen to be a player on the international stage in these international fora. And that's why I think particularly also the UK hosting the climate summit presents it with an opportunity to sort of leverage its role in sort of bringing people together. The big question in all of that is that, will the relationship between the UK and the EU continue to be stable, or will it sort of fall into disputes? Because I think the UK can only do so much to perhaps distract from its sort of challenges with Brussels that will continue.
Adi Renison, Lorenzo Cordonio, thank you both very much for joining us here on The Agenda.
Thank you.
Still to come here on The Agenda, more on transatlantic relations as we consider what the future holds for NATO under new President Biden.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
And welcome back to The Agenda. Before the break, we got a European take on future transatlantic relations, but what's the mood music coming out of Washington, D.C.? Well, joining me from there is Michael E. O'Hanlon, Director of Foreign Policy Research at the Brookings Institute. Michael, President Biden has made it very clear he's determined to focus on America in the first 100 days of his presidency. What does that say about transatlantic relations to you?
I don't think President Biden has much choice because of the COVID crisis, although I suspect that actually that message should be interpreted in a little bit more multilateralist way. And I think we'll probably hear in coming days the message that this has to be a global response to COVID. And so certainly any American president has to put America first. In that sense, what Donald Trump said was just belaboring the obvious. That would be true for any leader of any country anywhere on earth. They always put their own country first. But I don't really think Joe Biden's going to be unilateralist in that regard. I expect that even on the COVID crisis and the immediate response, he will have an eye on global economic recovery, on global sharing of vaccine capability, on increasing vaccine availability, not only in the United States, but around the world. There's no way to respond effectively to a global health crisis or a global economic crisis without taking a worldwide perspective. So I'm a little more hopeful that this will be, in fact, even with the focus on the United States, a multilateralist approach towards doing so.
So a very big world out there for a new president, and certainly, you're right, global challenges. Does that mean Europe, the view of Europe from Washington, isn't all that important at the moment?
The Biden administration will certainly feel that it's time to repair relations with Europe or do what we can here in the United States after 4 years of an extraordinarily disruptive Trump presidency, which was really unprecedented in the acrimony that it interjected into the transatlantic relationship, and often pointlessly so, often for little positive policy impact. You know, there were some issues and issue areas where even if Donald Trump was improvising and being impulsive and often quite belligerent, he still may have shaken things up in a way that can create some new opportunity. For example, on the US-China relationship, where I think some degree of disruption was needed, even if Trump himself didn't find the right path forward. But on Europe, I really feel that Trump was just needlessly petty, and a lot of his policy initiatives or pronouncements were pointless. And I think the Biden team would agree with what I just said and would look to restore a degree of harmony in handling Russia policy and NATO policy. On trade issues, we will put them back in their proper perspective. There may still be disagreements, but we won't treat them as existential threats to the alliance or the relationship. So that's the basic tone and approach that I would expect from the Biden team in regard to Europe.
You mentioned NATO there, Michael. You expect a very different approach to NATO from President Biden than that from President Trump?
Oh, absolutely. I was just, in fact, reviewing an op-ed that I wrote 4 years ago with Kathleen Hicks, who's our incoming Deputy Secretary of Defense, if she's confirmed. And we expressed strong disagreement with what Trump had said about NATO. And it's true, as you know, that American presidents and Congresses in general complain about burden sharing, don't think that Europe does enough to carry its fair weight. That's true in my judgment, but it doesn't mean that we should forget the enormous strengths that the most remarkable military alliance in history bring to all of us, really binding together 40 to 50% of world economic and military power, even though our original purpose is no longer there in the form of a Soviet threat. I think this is extraordinary. I think it's very stabilizing for world power politics. It's beneficial on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. And I certainly think that that will be the overall tenor. And, you know, you can point to specific things the Trump administration did that were not all bad in regard to NATO, the increased U.S. troop presence in Poland, support for the enhanced forward presence capabilities that other NATO allies have brought to the Baltic states, the sustaining of sanctions on Russia, even though Donald Trump himself didn't always seem enthusiastic about that. So there were elements of Trump policy that are not completely out of line and don't need to be reversed. But the overall atmosphere and tone and the sense of needing and benefiting from each other, that will be restored, I think, during the Biden years.
And another approach will be crucial, that of the attitude and approach to Russia. Will that differ at all? What will President Biden's view be of President Putin?
Well, here I'm a little bit of a critic of all the conventional wisdom in Washington, even predating Donald Trump. And I think that expanding NATO into the former Soviet space is a mistake. We should not do it anymore. We need to combine the existing Minsk II process on Ukraine, which, as you know, is going nowhere, with a broader vision how to think about the neutral and non-aligned countries of Eastern Europe and try to create some kind of accord with those countries and with Russia that we're going to essentially create a safe space, a neutral space, where we're not going to try to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, but we are going to insist that Russia keep its mitts off and treat those countries as sovereign entities. That's the kind of vision I hope the Biden team would come up with, and the rest of NATO as well, because as you know, NATO as an alliance is somehow committed to expand into the former Soviet space going back to 2008. I think that's a big mistake. I think it's the wrong policy, and I do hope the Biden team will want to work with NATO partners to reassess that approach towards Russia. But I don't yet know how to make a prediction. I'm not sure that'll be likely under the Biden team.
Okay, let's move, Michael, to Iran. Two conflicting approaches to sanctions and a nuclear deal in Europe and the US. What will President Biden's approach be to Iran?
Well, my own fear is, if anything, Biden will be too quick to want to agree with Europe on this matter. I'm not in the Trump camp, certainly, but I do think the Iran nuclear deal, which, as you know, starts to expire within 2 years, at least some of its restrictions on Iranian nuclear activity start to be relaxed in 2023, and then again, more of them in 2025. I think that makes the deal somewhat problematic. And rather than just return to it unconditionally, we should try to extend the deal, and get Iran to agree to an indefinite extension. Now, Iran's going to protest and say that that's going back on our word. But I think that, frankly, there are no nuclear non-proliferation deals that ask for good behavior only for a certain fraction of time, after which countries are unrestrained. Now, the Iran nuclear deal does have some stipulations that extend beyond 2025, and it certainly doesn't invite Iran to develop a nuclear weapon even after that date. But I still think the time horizon becomes problematic when you're already in the year 2021. So on that one, I actually hope that Biden takes at least a small dose of the Trump medicine and tries to extend the deal rather than just unconditionally return to it. However, my expectation is what I just said will not be Biden policy, and that, in fact, he will return to the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as most European countries would wish, and that he'll do so very soon.
Now, let's turn to Brexit. There have only been two big stories in Britain in the last 2 years, Brexit and COVID. In terms of Brexit, President Biden didn't like Brexit, and traditionally, America has wanted a British voice at the European table to represent America. If nothing else, Obama came over and told Britain to vote to stay in the EU. There was criticism from President Biden. Does that have any impact now, or is that part of campaign rhetoric and it's past, so we'll just get on with a new deal?
I hope he just gets on with it. Obviously, the British get to choose their own foreign policy associations. I'm not sure it made much sense for President Obama to publicly ask for one vote over another. if somebody did that here, we'd probably be crying foul that other countries were trying to
Well, they did
interfere
here
in
as
our
well.
elections. Yeah, and so I'm just not sure that's the best policy, even if you have a strong viewpoint or preference. But what's done appears to be done. And I think we need to remember historically, the United States and Britain have had a strong relationship way before the words European Union were ever even uttered. And there's no reason to think that this relationship needs to weaken. It'll be different. It'll be a little more complicated, and it may indeed, complicate our relationships with the European Union. But we've got a lot of good friends still in the European Union as well. And so I just think it is, as you say, time to move on, recognize that other countries make their choices, and we still have fantastic partners in Europe, even if they're organizing themselves slightly differently than before.
And the good news is that climate change is back on the US agenda, with President Biden promising to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. How might the US and EU and UK work together for a greener planet?
That's a great question. It's going to be easy for Biden to get a quick win on that and just say, I'm back in Paris. And aren't we Americans now wonderful again? We're all multilateralists. We're rejoining international accords. We rejoin the WHO and pay our dues. That's all the easy stuff. And as you know, the stakes and the magnitude of the global warming challenge are much greater than anything Paris could address or would address. And so the big question is going to be, do the gas guzzling Americans, and I count myself in that category, do we get serious in any kind of policy sense? Beyond just signing a piece of paper. And the good news is that technology is helping, as you know, whether it's renewables or gas, fracking, et cetera. But we have so far to go, and the planet's warming up. One more winter here in Washington, we're not having any snow, and it already feels practically like spring is just around the corner. I think it's pretty obvious that the climate has changed enormously, and just joining Paris, which at best slows the previous trajectory by a few percent, that's really not enough. So this is where Biden's going to have to decide. Does he do something much more serious, let's say, by this summer or fall, and really try to interject a big change that would potentially cost some Americans at least some money in greater taxes or higher energy bills? Or is he going to be content with a more symbolic rejoining of the Paris Accord? I don't know the answer to that.
Well, it's certainly interesting to hear the temperature in Washington is heating up, but in a good way. Michael E. O'Hanlon, many thanks for joining us on The Agenda.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Many politicians, diplomats and trade negotiators are eager to find out just what the future relationship will be between the US, EU and UK. And indeed, there are many questions to be asked and answered, and a lot of unknowns too in the early days of a new presidency. The challenges on trade, green issues, and of course the funding for NATO are the headlines. Of course, at some point there will be new trade deals with the UK and the EU, but with President Biden making it very clear he'll be putting domestic issues at the top of his agenda, it's anybody's guess as to when any such deals might even be discussed, let alone agreed. Just because President Trump has left the building after 4 fractious years, it doesn't mean all is necessarily rosy in the garden of transatlantic relations. Indeed, the past few years have given Europe the chance to test the waters of a very different kind of relationship with the United States, a more independent relationship. And while it's extremely unlikely, even unthinkable, that Europe would ever turn its back on its most important global partner, the continent has now learned that there are opportunities to go it alone, especially perhaps in relations with, for example, China. But there is still a desire to work together across the Atlantic. One Brussels diplomat, for example, being quoted as saying, "If we join forces, we can change things. We can make things better." The question now, though, is how quickly those changes might happen. And on those, we'll have to wait and see. Coming up on a future agenda, getting ready for takeoff and heading back to the moon, we'll be asking why astronauts could soon be returning for the first time in nearly 50 years. Don't forget you can watch everything from past Agenda episodes and find additional exclusive content on our website, cgtn.com/Europe, or on our YouTube channel. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, @CGTN Europe. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.